Part 1. Thorns. Listen, a farmer went out to plant some seed. As he scattered it across his field, some of the seed fell on a footpath, and the birds came and ate it. Other seed fell on shallow soil with underlying rock. The seed sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow, but the plant soon wilted under the hot sun, and since it didn't have deep roots, it died. Other seed fell among thorns that grew up and choked out the tender plant so that they produced no grain. Still other seed fell on fertile soil, and they sprouted, grew, and produced a crop that was 30, 60, and even 100 times as much as had been planted. Then Jesus said, "Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand." Ah, yes, the parable of the sower, a parable about all of the parables. All three synoptic gospels record this one, and not without cause. Jesus isn't just shooting the breeze. No. What Jesus is talking about is the potential hindrances blocking the road to maturity. For most of us, rocks and birds are not a problem. But thorns, now that's a different story. Which brings me to the crux of the matter, why I wrote this essay. I believe many of us, including myself, have gotten ourselves into a major predicament. That is, we are slowly, subtly, and silently being choked to death by thorns. So, by God's Spirit, through reading His Word with some careful self-examination, and not without some helpful insight from some seasoned Christians, let's endeavor together to identify the cause of these thorns. Moreover, let's seek to find a way to eradicate them. Let's fight back. Part 2. Thorns where you'd least expect them. Speaking in general terms, Jesus identifies thorns as the worries of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of this life, and the desire for other things. For our purposes, I would like to focus exclusively on pleasures of this life and the desire for other things. We'll leave worries and riches for another day. Francis Chan, author of Crazy Love, elaborates for us. Thorns are anything that distract us from God. When we want God and a bunch of other stuff, then that means we have thorns in our soil. A relationship with God simply cannot grow when sin, money, activities, favorite sport teams, addictions, or commitments are piled on top of it. Pay close attention. Notice that he lists money, activities, sports teams, and commitments separately from sins. In other words, in Chan's eyes, not all thorns are sinful. They could be as harmless as a favorite sports team. And this interpretation is not exclusive to him. John Piper, in his book, A Hunger for God, paints an even clearer picture for us. He says, the pleasures of this life and the desire for other things, these are not evil in and of themselves. They are not vices. These are gifts of God. They are your basic meat and potatoes and coffee and gardening and reading and decorating and traveling and investing and TV watching and internet surfing and shopping and exercising and collecting and talking. And all of them can become deadly substitutes for God. Wait a second. Gardening, decorating, exercising? Since when have they ever been wrong? Allow me to clarify. The pleasures of this life are not sinful. Like Piper says, these are gifts of God. At the same time, they have the potential of becoming deadly substitutes for God, even though they are not sinful in substance. So, it's the affection for them, the adoration of them, and the allegiance to them that we wage war against, not the things themselves. For example, Paul warns us that the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. Money on its own is no threat. On the other hand, affection for money is a major thorn. And of course, allegiance to money is a whole bed of thorns. If you are not yet on board, there is another parable that begs our attention. This one certainly attests to the fact that God's gifts carry with them deadly potential. It can be found in Luke's Gospel, the parable of the great feast. A man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servant to tell the guests, "Come, the banquet is ready." They all began making excuses. One said, "I have just bought a field and must inspect it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I have just bought 5 pairs of oxen, and I want to try them out. Please excuse me." Another said, "I now have a wife, so I can't come." The servant returned and told his master what they had said. His master was furious and said, "Go quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." After the servant had done this, he reported, "There is still more room." So the master said, "Go out into the country lanes and behind the hedges, and urge anyone you can find, so that the house will be full. For none of those I first invited will get even the smallest taste of my banquet." So the dinner host, i.e. God, is ticked off at his flaky guests. The question is, why are they in trouble? Is it because they're indulging in blatant sins? Is it because they haven't paid their tithes? Are they in trouble for breaking the Sabbath? Just what exactly did they do to make God so livid? The answer: they're in the hot seat for choosing God's gifts in place of God himself. They have treasured the temporary, and the eternal has lost its appeal. In effect, deadly thorns have sprung up because an unchallenged desire for God's gifts has overtaken them. Their fate, exclusion from his banquet, as a result of their own choices nonetheless. Jesus knows our fickle tendencies. He knows that we are inclined to choose temporary things instead of him. That's exactly why he told this parable. Some of God's sweetest gifts can very easily become huge distractions. Oswald Chambers explains our dilemma unambiguously. The greatest difficulty spiritually is to concentrate on God, and his blessings are what make it so difficult. Troubles almost always make us look to God, but his blessings tend to divert our attention elsewhere. John Piper couldn't agree more. Here's his explanation of the parable of the great feast. It's not the banquet of the wicked that dulls our appetite for heaven, but the endless nibbling at the table of the world. It is not the X-rated video, but the prime-time dribble of triviality we drink in every night. For all the ill that Satan can do when God describes what keeps us from the banquet table of his love. It's a piece of land, a yoke of oxen, and a wife. Luke 14. The greatest adversary of love of God is not his enemies, but his gifts. The most deadly appetites are not for the poison of evil, but for the simple pleasures of earth. For when these replace an appetite for God, the idolatry is scarcely recognizable and almost incurable. There you have it. The most deadly appetites are for God's gifts. Why? Because when an appetite for God's gifts replaces an appetite for God, the idolatry is scarcely recognizable. It's easy for an addict to recognize heroin as his God, but how slowly a husband is to admit his wife is his God. Accordingly, Jesus warns, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife, and children and brother and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Jesus demands a complete monopoly on our love. Yes, it's a tough pill to swallow, yet the hatred called for here is actually a lesser love. Jesus didn't actually call us to hate people. Family and friends are certainly not thorns, but when an appetite for them replaces your appetite for God, you better bet there's going to be thorns in your soil. My teenage years are a textbook example of this. God took the back burner, while my friends stole the spotlight.